Tom Oar is busier now than ever before, and today he is preparing himself for a task that feels far from ordinary. He begins his morning the same way he always does, after he has coffeed up and shaken off the last bit of sleep. But instead of a typical day on the trapline, he announces, almost casually, that today we're going to skin these two out legs. What he doesn't realize yet is that something incredibly strange has been discovered only a minute earlier along his trapline. And that discovery has everyone buzzing with confusion and curiosity. Tom Oar's long-sealed trapline cache, an old storage spot that had remained untouched and frozen for years, was finally opened. And what the team found inside shocked everyone. Before diving into the full unfolding mystery, people were reminded to like the video and subscribe so they wouldn't miss the rest of the developing story. After all, whatever had been discovered deep out there in the harsh cold had already started a storm of questions. What exactly had been sealed inside that frozen cache? Why would Tom hide something there? And what did this discovery mean? The strange event took place early in the morning during what was supposed to be a routine inspection. A small team had been moving through the area, clearing the trail after a long stretch of brutal weather. None of them expected to find anything unusual. They were simply checking the usual station's landmarks, supply points, and structures that often need maintenance after freezing storms pile up ice and snow. Tom's Trapline cache was one of those familiar spots they were assigned to check. Tom himself wasn't present at the time, but they had full permission to examine the area, especially after the storm had whipped through and scattered debris everywhere. But from the outside, the cache looked the same, as always, solid, frozen, unmoving. But that morning, the temperature had shifted just enough for the thick ice sealing the lid to begin cracking. The sharp sound echoed through the still air, instantly drawing the team's attention. They stopped everything they were doing and turned toward the noise. The lid had moved only a little, not enough to open, but just enough to reveal that something inside was pushing back against the layer of ice. For a moment, no one spoke. They approached slowly, unsure if an animal had somehow forced its way inside or if the storm had weakened the structure. But as they got closer, they noticed strange details. Markings precise, unnatural, appeared along the side of the cache. They weren't animal scratches, they weren't random dents. They looked like someone had been trying to pry open the lid days earlier but had failed. One team member wiped away the frost with their glove and revealed grooves carved into the surface. Another member pointed out faint tracks in the snow, but the violent wind from the storm had nearly erased them. They couldn't tell whether they belonged to animals or humans. Uneasiness began spreading through the group. Someone suggested that maybe the storm had simply caused the lid to shift under pressure, but the grooves didn't resemble storm damage. They looked That was what made everyone stop and reconsider. But the team decided they needed to open the cache, not because of curiosity, but because something felt undeniably wrong. They had to make sure nothing inside had spoiled or been tampered with. At first, the lid wouldn't move. The ice clung to it like glue. Two people lifted, pushed, and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Eventually another crew joined in, and they used a heated tool to melt the ice along the edge. Slowly, the ice began to soften, then crack, then give way. Once the seal finally broke, a sudden burst of warm air escaped from inside the cache. Warm air from a box that had been frozen in sub-zero temperatures for days. The team froze, exchanging confused glances. Some raised their eyebrows. Others instinctively stepped back. Nothing about this made sense. A frozen, sealed cache shouldn't release heat. But now that the seal was broken, they had no choice but to open it fully. Together, they heaved the lid open. This time it slid loose, falling into the snow with a heavy thud. At first glance, everything inside looked normal. Layers of hides, gear, and supplies filled the space. But the arrangement seemed wrong. The furs were uneven and pressed down in strange ways, not the way they naturally settled over time. Then someone pointed out movement beneath the top hide, a subtle shift, but enough to stir the edge of the fur. The team leaned closer. The hide moved again. This wasn't the wind. It wasn't the heat. Something beneath it was causing the motion. One member cautiously lifted the fur, and a wave of unnatural warmth drifted upward. Someone whispered that maybe an animal had burrowed inside, but the opening was too small for anything larger than a rodent. And rodents did not produce that level of warmth, not in these temperatures. As they pulled away more layers, the strangeness increased. Supplies that should have been neatly arranged were scattered or shoved aside. A metallic glint flashed beneath one of the hides. The team cleared more coverings until the object underneath became partially visible. It had a textured surface, with a long, narrow frame, nothing like anything that should be in a trapline cache. That realization made everyone go silent. They continued clearing the area until the entire object came into view. Its weight, shape, and markings didn't match any trapping gear, tools, or equipment Tom used. Someone lifted it, turning it in their hands. The markings were deliberate, but foreign. It wasn't a broken sled part. It wasn't machinery. Someone had clearly placed it there on purpose. carefully burying it beneath the furs. Another team member brushed off the remaining frost, revealing even more odd details. Everything about this object was intentional, organized, and positioned in a way that felt calculated, not random. That led to the inevitable question, who would carry something like this all the way out here? And why hide it inside Tom's frozen cache? No one had an answer. To make things even stranger, the rest of the supplies inside the cache were untouched, meaning whoever placed the object wasn't rummaging around. They made space only where they needed it. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Someone stepped aside to contact Tom for clarification, but the signal immediately failed. Storm damage had knocked out the connection. The team regrouped, staring down at the object again. Someone suggested checking for tracks, but the storm had erased almost everything. Slight impressions were visible, but none clear enough to identify whether they came from a person or an animal. When they returned to the cache, they noticed something new. The bottom furs were warmer than the top. That shouldn't be possible. There were no heaters, no electronics, nothing that could create or hold warmth for days under ice. Then, underneath a folded hide, they found a patch of melted frost that had refrozen into thin, glass-like sheets. The warmth had come from the object itself. That realization made the group uneasy. Someone asked if the object could be dangerous, but dangerous how? No one knew. Another wondered if they should seal the cache and walk away, but that felt irresponsible now that the cache had been disturbed. They carried the object to a spot with better light. The markings were clearer now, strange patterns, smoothed edges, and signs that parts of the frame had been recently polished, as if someone cleaned it before hiding it. That only made things more suspicious. Then, as the wind suddenly rushed through the clearing, snow shook off tree branches, and everyone instinctively looked around, half expecting someone to appear, but no one did. The forest was silent, and then someone noticed an imprint beneath where the object had been sitting. Impression in the furs, suggesting that another object had been resting underneath. They lifted the final layer of hide, and there, partially buried, was another item. This one looked even stranger, heavier, less defined, duller in color. Its texture didn't resemble metal, wood, or anything they recognized. A faint fog dripped above it from the warmth rising out of the cache. No one wanted to touch it at first. Finally, one team member knelt down, brushed away the remaining frost, and carefully placed their glove on its surface. It felt smooth and evenly shaped, showing signs of deliberate craftsmanship. When they moved their hands around the edge, they realized it was larger than it first appeared. They grabbed it firmly and pulled. It didn't move. It felt anchored, almost as if the warmth beneath had fused it slightly into the bottom of the cache. They pulled hard until finally the object lifted with a reluctant crack, tearing free from the icy surface beneath it. As the object finally came loose, its weight nearly dropped their arms to their sides. It was far heavier than any of them had expected. They rose slowly, lifting it high enough for the rest of the group to see. What they held was rectangular and thick, its edges sealed tightly as if someone had gone out of their way to lock it shut forever. It didn't look like any kind of box or gear container used on a trapline, nor did it belong anywhere in the wilderness. It looked more like something that should have been tucked away in an archive, a private collection, or some forgotten storage unit not buried deep in frozen isolation. Its surface was dark, with a faint sheen that reflected light, but showed no clear image back. The material wasn't wood or metal. It was something unfamiliar, something crafted with intention. Everyone leaned closer for a better look. One person noticed faint markings along the side symbols etched or pressed into the surface. Brushed away the frost to see the patterns more clearly, but even then, unease spread through the group again. They had now uncovered two objects from inside Tom Oar's cache, two items that didn't belong here. Two things deliberately hidden, and neither explained the unnatural heat trapped within the furs. Someone suggested opening the object, but another quickly advised against it. The concern wasn't fear, but logic. Opening an unknown, tightly sealed object in the middle of the freezing woods without knowing what it contained wasn't wise. They agreed to examine the exterior first. The one holding it carefully turned it over. The bottom was smoother, with fewer marks. The seams showed no hinges or latches. It wasn't designed to be opened easily, and that alone raised new questions. If someone wanted to store something that couldn't be opened casually, why hide it here? Why tuck it inside a remote trapline cache that only a handful of people would ever inspect? They set the object gently onto the snow. Immediately, its warmth melted a small circle beneath it, releasing a faint mist. The contrast between the frozen ground and the subtle heat radiating from it made the object seem almost alive, though clearly it wasn't. They checked the bottom of the cache again. If two strange objects had been hidden here, there might be more. A hand searched along the damp wooden floor. The moment the air hit the wood, a thin layer of water refroze instantly. Then something small clicked against gloved fingertips. They paused, feeling around until they pinched a tiny piece of metal and lifted it into view. It was thin, slightly bent, and roughly the size of a coin. Tiny holes dotted its surface. arranged in a pattern that didn't match anything any of them recognized. The team gathered close as the person held it up. The holes were deliberate, forming a shape hole, most like a symbol. Someone wondered whether the metal piece had broken off from the rectangular object, but after comparing them, they realized the materials were completely different. The rectangular object was dense and sturdy. This metal piece was too light and delicate to have ever belonged to it. They set the metal fragment aside and continued searching. Cold mist rose from the wood, mixing with their breath. Beneath the frost they found scraps of fabric pieces that didn't belong to Tom's supplies. One strip looked woven, another resembled leather, but didn't feel like any leather they knew. Each fragment had been flattened beneath the hidden objects as if someone had intentionally bundled them together before burying them. The deeper they searched, the clearer the unsettling truth became. This wasn't accidental. Someone had placed these items here deliberately, someone who knew this cache, someone who trusted the cold and isolation to protect whatever secret they were hiding. They gathered everything. The long-framed object, the rectangular sealed piece, the thin metal fragment, and the strange fabrics into a cleared patch in the snow. They stood around the collection, each waiting for someone else to form an explanation. But every theory fell apart before anyone could speak it. Finally, someone voiced the question no one wanted to ask. Is Tom responsible for this? They exchanged looks. They couldn't rule it out. Whoever hid these items needed Tom had that access. Another person suggested the opposite. Maybe Tom didn't hide them at all. Maybe someone else used his cache to store these objects, knowing that if they were ever discovered, suspicion would fall on him. Both possibilities felt heavy as they cleared the last bits of frost near the bottom corner of the cache. Something else appeared, something they had missed at first glance. A final clue, one that shifted the entire direction of their search. Beneath a layer of ice, they found another lid. This one felt different, colder, older, and more tightly claimed by frost. No one spoke as they brushed away the snow and gripped its edge. Their gloves scraped against the ice. When they lifted it, the hinge released a slow, unnatural squeak, not the sound of rusted metal, but something older, something stiffened by years of frost. At first they saw nothing. Then the flashlight beam landed on a long shape wrapped in something thick and stiff. The wrapping looked like hide, frozen so solid it might as well have been stone. They used the back of a knife to chip away frost around it. When they finally dragged it free, it fell onto the snow with a thud far too heavy for its size. Rawhide straps held it together, knotted so tightly no one could loosen them. They heated the knife tip with a portable burner, and the frozen knots hissed as they soft, releasing the faint smell of warmed leather. It took nearly 15 minutes before the roll loosened enough to open. When the first layer uncurled, the entire group froze. Inside were dozens of drawings etched directly into the hide-lun lines of symbols, spirals, and shapes. They weren't landscapes or animals or any traditional trapping scenes. Some figures didn't even look fully human, and in the middle of the hide was a perfect circle carved so deeply that the edges were smooth. Inside the circle was a single symbol. When the flashlight hit that symbol, everyone went silent. Someone whispered that they recognized it. Two of the curved markings on the metal fragment matched parts of this central symbol, almost as though the metal piece was only one part of a larger design. Their realization crashed over them. These objects were connected. None of this was random. This was not a trapper stash, nor a supply cache. This was something else, something hidden with purpose. As the man holding the flashlight studied the spirals, he noticed they weren't random either. The lines pointed toward the far end of the hide. They're tightly wrapped inside the first roll was a second bundle, smaller, harder sealed, wrapped it the same way, but stitched shut with sinew, so tough it had merged with the hide. This wasn't something made casually. This was intended with the purpose of never being opened. The leader knelt, ran his fingers across the frozen stitches, and looked around. No one objected. They all knew they needed to see what was inside. Another heated blade was pressed to the seams, but the sinew refused to melt. Layer by layer it cracked until the final stitch split. The bundle loosened slightly, just enough for light to slip inside. Someone leaned in, saw what was inside, and went still. A tool folded, heavy, unfamiliar. They lifted it free. Frost cracked around it like brittle glass. Its weight shocked them, but its design unsettled them even more. It was nothing that belonged here, nothing that explained the warmth, nothing that should have been abandoned in an icy wilderness. Someone had been here before them. Someone had sealed this object away intentionally. At the very bottom they found an envelope thicker than a normal letter, almost padded. The writing on it was faded, nearly unreadable, but 3 words stood out: must not be found. The envelope trembled in the holder's hands. Inside were scraps of paper filled with strange handwriting, sketches, diagrams, and fragmented notes, referencing objects stored in secrecy vents that didn't match anything they knew about Tom or the Trapline. These were warnings, records, instructions no one was meant to read. By now, the group had stopped speaking entirely. Every item raised, more questions. The careful organization and extreme secrecy hinted at planning, fear, and a side of Tom Oar none of them had ever imagined. Snow began to fall harder, as if trying to bury the cache once more. They gathered everything slowly, silently. The final object had changed everything. This no longer felt like uncovering a hidden stash, it felt like intruding on something forbidden. As they packed the last of the items, they couldn't help glancing back at the empty compartment, the place where the secret had slept beneath the ice.